Belgian police storm into a shipping container at the port of Antwerp, only to find a torture chamber straight out of a horror movie. Complete with a dentist chair, straps, and an array of tools designed to inflict unimaginable pain. This isn't the kind of scene you'd expect in a country known for its chocolates and waffles, but it's becoming all too common.
Belgian chocolate, the best in the world.
Belgium makes the best chocolate.
Belgium, the new heart of Europe's crack trade, is now a battlefield where narcotic cartels rule. How did a once peaceful nation become the epicenter of such brutal chaos? Belgium, for many years, was the epitome of peace and tranquility in Europe. It was a place where you could walk down the cobblestone streets of Brussels or Bruges without a care in the world, where the biggest concerns were the occasional rain showers and deciding whether to enjoy a waffle or a piece of chocolate next. The country had a reputation for being safe, even a bit dull, with low crime rates and a population that valued its quiet way of life. It was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked, where kids played freely in the streets, and where the notion of violent crime seemed as foreign as the exotic spices that flavoured its famous dishes. But, as they say, still waters run deep, and beneath Belgium's serene surface, something sinister was beginning to brew. The transformation of Belgium into a hotbed of coke trafficking didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process, one that took root in the very strengths that had once made the country an example of efficiency and order. Belgium, in many ways, was a victim of its own success, particularly when it came to logistics and transportation. If you think about it, the same characteristics that make a place ideal for international trade also make it a prime target for those who operate in the shadows. Belgium, with its highly developed infrastructure, its central location in Europe, and its massive ports, was an irresistible lure for narcotic traffickers looking for a gateway into the lucrative European market. One of the most significant factors in Belgium's evolution into a coke trafficking hub is the port of Antwerp. Now, Antwerp might not be the first place you think of when you hear about global narcotics operations, but in reality, it's one of the busiest ports in the world, second only to Rotterdam in Europe. With its strategic location on the river Schelde, Antwerp had long been a major entry point for goods coming into Europe. Every year, the port handles about 12 million containers. Just imagine that, 12 million. Each one potentially filled with anything from toys to electronics to, as we now know, massive quantities of crack. Let's start at the beginning, how this whole business operates. In the lush green hills of South America, where the coca plant thrives, coca leaves have been harvested for centuries, originally used by indigenous peoples for their mild stimulant properties. But in the hands of modern-day traffickers, these innocuous leaves are the first step in creating one of the world's most dangerous and profitable narcotics, crack. The process begins with the coca leaves being harvested and then soaked in a mixture of chemicals, often including gasoline, to extract the crack alkaloid. This paste is then further refined into a powder through a series of chemical processes, typically conducted in makeshift labs hidden deep within the jungles. These labs are often guarded by heavily armed men, prepared to attack anyone who stumbles upon their operation. For the fathers and the lab workers, this is their livelihood. They're often paid pennies for their labor, literally. The price of coca leaves is dirt cheap, sometimes just a few dollars per kilo. For the people at the bottom of this operation, it's not a glamorous life. It's one of survival. They live in constant fear of both the law and the cartels that control their every move. They have no other option. It's their only means of survival. Once the crack is refined into its powdered form, it's ready to make a long journey across the world. At this point, a kilo of crack is worth a few $100s, maybe more depending on its purity. But that price will skyrocket as it crosses borders, passing through the hands of countless middlemen, each taking their cut and driving up the cost. As it makes its way north, it often travels through treacherous routes controlled by notorious cartels like the Sinaloa, Gulf, and Juarez cartels, each wielding their own brand of violence to maintain control and protect their lucrative operations. These are not just business people, they are violent criminals who will stop at nothing to protect their products. The routes themselves are treacherous, crossing rivers, mountains, and dense jungles. But the most dangerous part is the human element. Corrupt officials, rival gangs, and even local militias who might try to intercept the shipment. Violence is part and parcel of this trade, and the casualties left in its wake are a testament to the ruthlessness of those involved. When the crack finally reaches the shores of Europe, it's worth many times what it was in South America. A kilo that cost a few $100s might now be worth tens of thousands. But that's just the beginning. Once it hits the streets, it's often cut with other substances, anything from baby powder to dangerous chemicals, to increase its volume. By the time it reaches the end user, a gram of crack in Europe can fetch anywhere from 60 to over 100 euros, depending on the quality. That's thousands of dollars of profit per kilo, and that's what drives this entire deadly operation. Antwerp, as we've discussed, is one of the busiest ports in the world. Its infrastructure is top-notch, designed to move goods quickly and efficiently. But that efficiency is a double-edged sword. The same system that makes Antwerp a great place for legal trade also makes it incredibly difficult to catch illegal shipments. Every year, millions of containers pass through the port. These containers come from all over the world, carrying everything from electronics to foodstuffs, and hidden among them, more often than we'd like to think, are containers packed with crack. The sheer volume of goods moving through the port makes it impossible for authorities to check every container. Even with the most advanced technology, only a fraction of the shipments can be thoroughly inspected. Narcotics traffickers are well aware of this. They've become experts at exploiting the gaps in the system. Sometimes they'll hide crack in seemingly innocuous shipments, like bananas or furniture. Other times, they'll simply pack it in a container and hope it slips through unnoticed. And more often than not, it does. The authorities are playing a game of chance, trying to find a needle in a haystack, and the traffickers are more than willing to take the risk because the rewards are astronomical. Take, for instance, the record-breaking seizure in 2020 when Belgian authorities intercepted 11.5 tons of crack in a single bust at Antwerp. That's worth billions on the street. But here's the thing, those 11.5 tons were just a drop in the bucket. The traffickers expect to lose some of their products along the way. They build those losses into their business model. The logistics in Belgium are not just about the ports. The country's central location in Europe makes it an ideal hub for distributing crack throughout the continent. From Belgium, it can be quickly and efficiently transported to neighbouring countries like France, Germany, and the Netherlands. Belgium's road and rail networks are among the best in Europe, and traffickers use them to move their products swiftly and quietly. This brings us to the concept of the luck of the draw in narcotics trafficking. For the authorities, catching a shipment is often just that, luck. They can't possibly check every container, so they focus on the ones that raise red flags. But traffickers are smart. They know how to avoid detection. They use sophisticated methods to hide their product, and they're constantly changing their tactics to stay one step ahead of the law. Sometimes they'll send decoy shipments to distract customs officials, allowing the real cargo to slip through unnoticed. Other times, they'll bribe officials or use insider information to ensure their shipments make it through without a hitch. For law enforcement, it's a never-ending battle. They're up against well-funded, well-organized criminal organizations that have the resources to adapt and evolve. And while the authorities do their best, the reality is that they're fighting a losing battle. The traffickers only need to get lucky once. The police have to be lucky every time. And in this game, luck is in short supply, unless you have a cartel backing. When you think of narcotic cartels, the image that probably comes to mind is of violent gangs in Latin America. Men with AK-47s slung over their shoulders, standing guard over fields of coca plants, or overseeing the shipment of crack from secret airstrips. For years, the focus of these cartels was on getting their product into the United States, the world's largest consumer of illegal narcotics. But as the US tightened its borders and ramped up legal enforcement efforts, the cartels began to look for other markets. And where did they find their new gold mine? Europe. Europe, with its affluent population and growing appetite for coke, presented an opportunity too good for the South American cartels to pass up. Unlike the US, where law enforcement has been waging a war on narcotics for decades, Europe's approach has often been less aggressive, and in many ways, less effective. The shift from the US to Europe didn't happen overnight. It was a calculated move by the cartels, driven by the simple economics of supply and demand. In the US, the market was becoming increasingly saturated, with more risk and less reward. The authorities were getting better at intercepting shipments, and the cost of doing business was rising. But in Europe, the demand for crack was skyrocketing, especially in affluent countries like the UK, Germany, and Belgium. The European market was not just larger, it was also far more profitable. A kilo of crack that might fetch $30,000 in the US could easily go for double or triple that in Europe. The profit margins were simply too good to ignore. However, moving into Europe presented a new set of challenges for the South American cartels. They couldn't operate in Europe the way they did in Latin America. They needed local partners, criminal organizations that knew the terrain, had established networks, and could distribute the product efficiently. Enter the European mafias. These partnerships weren't just about business, they were about survival. The South American cartels needed reliable allies in Europe, and they found them in the various mafia groups that have plagued the continent. These mafias, with their roots in countries like Italy, Russia, and the Balkans, were more than happy to work with the cartels. After all, the narcotic trade was already a lucrative part of their operations, and partnering with the South Americans allowed them to expand their reach and increase their profits. The relationship between the South American cartels and the European mafias is built on trust, something that's incredibly rare in the underworld. Both sides knew that betrayal means death, not just for them, but for their families as well. This mutual understanding has allowed these criminal enterprises to flourish, creating a network that spans continents and moves billions of dollars of crack each year. This brings us to the Balkan mafias, particularly the Albanian gangs that have risen to prominence in Europe. These are not your traditional mafias, bound by codes of honor or respect. The Balkan gangs, especially the Albanians, are some of the most ruthless criminals you'll find anywhere in the world. They operate with a level of brutality that's shocking even by mafia standards. The rise of the Albanian mafias in Europe is a story of how far war breeds violence and how that violence spills over into the underworld. Albania, like many of the Balkan states, has a history marred by conflict. The wars that tore through the Balkans in the 1990s left a generation of young men hardened by violence, men who saw death as a daily part of their life. When the war ended, many of these men found themselves with no jobs, no prospects, and no way to channel their aggression. The criminal world offered them a solution, a way to make money, gain power, and continue the violence that had come to know so well. The Albanian mafias quickly established themselves as a force to be reckoned with in Europe. They moved in the narcotics trade with a ferocity that caught many off guard. Unlike the older, more established mafias who often tried to keep a low profile, the Albanians embraced violence as a tool of their trade. They didn't just threaten their enemies, they made examples of them. Stories began to circulate about the brutal methods of the Albanians used to enforce their will. These were not empty threats, they were a way of life. The Albanian mafias have become so powerful that they now control much of the narcotics trade in Europe, including the crack flowing through Belgium. Their reputation for violence, combined with their ability to move large quantities of narcotics quickly and efficiently, has made them indispensable to the South American cartels. The cartels know that if they want their product to reach European streets, they need the Albanians on their side. But it's not just the Albanians. The Balkan region as a whole has produced some of the most dangerous criminals Europe has ever seen. These are men who grew up in war zones and watched as their countries were torn apart by violence and corruption. For them, crime is not just a way to make money, it's a way to survive. The mafias of the Balkans have brought a new level of brutality to the European underworld, and their influence is only growing. In the end, the relationship between the South American cartels and the European mafias is one of mutual benefit. The cartels provide the product, and the mafias provide the distribution networks and the muscle to ensure it reaches its destination. It's a partnership built on blood and money, one that has turned Europe into the new epicenter of the global crack trade. Belgium, with its strategic location and world-class infrastructure, is at the heart of it all. As the narcotic trade continues to evolve, so too will the players involved. The cartels and the European mafias are constantly adapting to new challenges, finding new ways to move their product and protect their interests. The violence that follows in their wake is not just a byproduct of their business, it's a necessary part of it. For them, there's no such thing as too much chaos, too much brutality. It's all just part of the game, a game where the stakes are life and death, and the rewards are unimaginable wealth and power. And as long as there's demand for crack in Europe, these players will continue to thrive. What we see now is a country on the brink, overwhelmed by a wave of violence so brutal that it feels like something out of a nightmare. This is the new reality for Belgium, a nation transformed into a battleground for some of the world's most dangerous criminals, where the rules of civility and law have been replaced by terror. The rise of narco-terrorism in Belgium didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual descent, one that began when the country became a key hub for crack trafficking in Europe. As the narcotic trade flourished, so too did the violence that always followed in its wake. What started as a few isolated incidents has now spiraled into a full-blown crisis, with gun battles, grenade attacks, and kidnappings becoming disturbingly common. One of the most chilling examples of this new wave of violence is the discovery of a torture chamber in Antwerp, hidden away in what appeared to be an ordinary shipping container. When Belgian police opened the doors, they were met with a scene straight out of a horror film. Inside was a dentist's chair, fitted with straps on the armrests and footrests, clearly designed for the purpose of restraining victims. Surrounding the chair were an array of tools, saws and scalpels, pliers, and other implements of torment. It was a gruesome reminder of just how far these criminals are willing to go to maintain their power. This chamber was not an anomaly. It was a testament to the extreme depravity that has become the norm in Belgium's criminal underworld. The gangs operating in the country, particularly the Balkan mafias, have brought with them a level of brutality that is almost unimaginable. The methods they use are designed to instill fear and assert dominance. In one case, a man who'd crossed the Albanian mafia was captured and subjected to hours of torment before being executed. The message was clear: betrayal would not be tolerated, and the consequences would be severe. But it's not just about the attacks, it's about the fear that these acts generate. In cities like Antwerp and Brussels, ordinary citizens are living in constant fear, knowing that they could be caught in the crossfire at any moment. Gun battles have erupted in broad daylight, with bullets flying through crowded streets. In one particularly shocking incident, a grenade was thrown into a busy market, attacking several people and injuring dozens more. The violence is indiscriminate, and no one is safe. As is often the case, with fear comes corruption. The violence has not only taken a toll on the streets, but has also seeped into the very institutions that are supposed to protect the public. Corruption has always been a problem in the world of organised crime, but in Belgium, it has reached new heights. The sheer amount of money involved in the narcotics trade is staggering, and for many, the temptation to take a cut is too great to resist. Corruption in Belgium wasn't limited to just a few low-level workers. It had infiltrated the highest echelons of power. The most shocking example came in 2020, when Francois, the head of Belgium's narcotics division, was arrested for colluding with the very criminals he was supposed to be fighting. Francois, who'd been at the helm of the country's war on drugs for nearly a decade, was found to have been passing critical information to the Albanian and Moroccan gangs, helping them avoid detection and ensuring their shipments made it safely through Antwerp's port. The investigation revealed that this betrayal had been going on for years, with Francois receiving substantial payments in exchange for his silence and cooperation. But Francois wasn't the only one involved. In a sweeping operation that same year, Belgian authorities arrested several other high-ranking officials, including members of the Public Prosecutor's Office and even top tax officials. These individuals were found to be on the payroll of the drug cartels, receiving large sums of money to turn a blind eye to the smuggling operations, or worse, to actively facilitate them. The investigation uncovered a deeply rooted network of corruption, where key government figures were complicit in the drug trade, making it nearly impossible for law enforcement to mount an effective defense against the cartels. The extent of the corruption was so pervasive that it shattered public confidence in the government's ability to protect its citizens, revealing a system where no part of the state seemed untouched by the influence of organized crime. For those working on the front lines, the situation is even more dire. Port workers, customs officials, and port officers are all targets for bribery and intimidation. The gangs know that if they can't buy someone off, they can always resort to violence. The choice for these workers often comes down to plata or plomo, silver or lead. Take the bribe or face the consequences. For many, the decision is an easy one. A single payment of 50,000 euros for ignoring a suspicious container could be enough to pay off debts, send kids to college, or secure a future. The alternative? Refuse, and risk being hit in the streets or having your family intimidated. Every time they make the authorities make a breakthrough, arresting a key figure or intercepting a major shipment, it seems like the criminals are always one step ahead, thanks to the inside information they receive from their corrupt contacts. It's a never-ending cycle, one that leaves law enforcement frustrated and the public disillusioned. The corruption extends beyond individual bribes. It's systemic, ingrained in the very structure of the institutions that are supposed to uphold the law. For some, the money flowing in from the narcotics trade is too good to pass up. After all, what's the harm in turning a blind eye to one shipment when there are so many more coming through? But this kind of thinking only fuels the problem, allowing the gangs to operate with near impunity. As the violence continues to escalate, Belgium finds itself at a crossroads. The country is being torn apart by forces that are seemingly beyond its control. The once peaceful streets are now battlegrounds. The institutions meant to protect the public are riddled with corruption, and the fear that pervades everyday life is eroding the very fabric of society. The descent into chaos is accelerating, and unless something changes, it's hard to see how Belgium can pull itself back from the brink. Belgium's descent into chaos is a stark reminder of the devastating impact that the coke trade can have on a country. The violence that has erupted in its wake has left a trail of fear, transforming a peaceful nation into a war zone. The corruption that has taken hold at every level of society has only made the situation worse, creating an environment where criminals can operate with impunity. For the people of Belgium, the question now is whether there's any way to reclaim their country from the grip of narco-terrorism, or whether they will be forced to live in fear as their nation continues its descent into chaos. Europe's appetite for crack has reached staggering levels. In countries like Albania and the UK, the rates of coke use are some of the highest in the world. Albania, for instance, has become a hub of sorts for narcotic consumption, with some of the highest per capita rates of crack use in Europe. It's a country that has struggled with organised crime for years, and the influx of crack has only made things worse. The UK isn't far behind. Despite its tough talk on narcotics, the country is awash in crack, with more people consuming it now than ever before. It's gotten so bad that traces of crack has been found in the bathrooms of the British Parliament, proof that the narcotics reach knows no bounds. Belgium's role in this growing crisis is clear. It's not just a transit point, it's the linchpin in a vast network that stretches from the coca fields of South America to the clubs and streets of Europe's biggest cities. The crack that arrives in Antwerp doesn't stay in Belgium. It's distributed across the continent, fueling an epidemic that is showing no signs of slowing down. The spread of Belgian narcotic influence has been a ripple effect across Europe, particularly in neighbouring countries like the Netherlands and the UK. The Netherlands, with its massive port in Rotterdam, has seen a significant increase in narcotic-related violence as Belgian criminal networks expand their operations. These aren't just small-time gangs. These are sophisticated, well-funded organisations that operate with military precision. They've brought with them a level of violence that the Dutch authorities are struggling to contain. In the UK, the influence of Belgian narcotics operations is equally apparent. The country has long been a major market for coke, and the influx of high-purity narcotics from Belgium has only increased the demand. But it's not just the narcotics that are crossing the channel, it's the violence too. Belgian criminal networks have established footholds in cities across the UK, bringing with them the same brutal tactics that have turned parts of Belgium into war zones. The violence in the UK isn't just random, it's targeted, calculated, and designed to send a message. Rival gangs are being eliminated, and anyone who gets in the way is dealt with swiftly and mercilessly. Take, for example, the case of a British dealer who was found dead in a quiet suburb of London. His body was discovered in the trunk of a car, his hands bound, and his face beyond recognition. It was a clear sign that Belgian criminals were making their presence felt in the UK, and it sent shockwaves through the local community. The message was clear. This was what happens when you cross the wrong people. The involvement of European mafias in the Belgian narcotics trade has only made the situation more complex. The Albanian gangs, as we've discussed, are some of the most brutal, but they're not the only ones involved. The Russian mafia, with its deep ties to organised crime across Europe, has also gotten in on the action. The Russians bring with them a level of sophistication and ruthlessness that few can match. They've been involved in everything from human trafficking to arms dealing, and their entry into the narcotics trade has only added to their power. The Turkish mafia has long held a notorious reputation in Europe, particularly for their control over the heroin trade. They've been the backbone of distribution across the continent for decades, with deep-rooted connections stretching from the fields of Afghanistan to the streets of European cities. But in recent years, they've expanded their criminal empire, venturing into new and even more profitable territories, including the crack market. This move has solidified their position as one of the most powerful criminal organizations in Belgium's increasingly chaotic narcotics trade. The expansion of the Turkish mafia into coke didn't happen by chance. It was a calculated move that capitalized on the shifting dynamics of the European drug market. As demand for crack grew, particularly in urban areas with high poverty and unemployment rates, the Turks saw an opportunity to diversify their operations and increase their profits. Belgium, with its strategic location and booming drug trade, became a focal point for their new endeavors. By 2018, the Turkish mafia had fully integrated coke into their existing drug distribution networks. They leveraged their established routes, adding crack to the list of illicit goods flowing into Europe. Antwerp, already a hub for coke trafficking, became a key entry point for these shipments. From there, the drugs were distributed to various cities across Europe, including Brussels, Rotterdam, and Amsterdam. The scale of their operations grew rapidly, and with it, so did their influence. One of the most significant incidents that highlighted the Turkish mafia's growing power in Belgium occurred in 2019. A police raid in the Anderlecht district of Brussels uncovered a sophisticated drug processing facility operated by the Turks. Inside, authorities found large quantities of crack, heroin, and meth, along with the equipment necessary to refine and package them for distribution. The raid also led to the arrest of several higher-ranking members of the Turkish mafia, including a notorious figure known as Mehmet the Chemist Yildiz. Yildiz was infamous for his ability to refine drugs to extremely high purities, making the product more potent and thus more valuable on the streets. Despite the success of this raid, it became clear that the Turkish mafia's grip on the Belgian drug trade was far from broken. In fact, the bust only seemed to galvanize the organization. Within months, there were reports of increased hits in Brussels and Antwerp as the Turks sought to reassert their dominance and eliminate any threats to their operations. Shootouts became more frequent, and the brutality of these confrontations shocked even seasoned law enforcement officers. In one particularly gruesome incident, 2 rival drug dealers were found executed in a warehouse outside of Antwerp, with a clear message from the Turks: "Cross us and you'll pay the ultimate price." The chaos wasn't just limited to turf wars either. The Turkish mafia's expansion into crack brought with it a new level of intimidation and control over local communities. They used fear to maintain their stranglehold on neighborhoods, targeting anyone who dared to oppose them. In 2020, a whistleblower who'd provided information to the police about the mafia's activities was hit in his home in Charleroi. His body was found by his wife, tied to a chair and showing signs of torment. The reach of the Turkish mafia extends beyond just the distribution of drugs. They're also deeply involved in money laundering, human trafficking, and arms smuggling. Their operations are highly organized, with a clear hierarchy and strict discipline. Members of the mafia are often recruited from within the Turkish immigrant communities in Europe, where they can blend in more easily and avoid detection by the authorities. This integration into local communities makes them particularly difficult to infiltrate and disrupt. The Moroccan mafia is another powerful group that has made significant inroads into the Belgian narcotics trade. Morocco has long been a major producer of cannabis, and the Moroccan mafia has used its established smuggling routes to move crack across Europe. They've also brought with them a level of corruption that is difficult to combat. In many parts of Europe, particularly in Belgium, Moroccan criminal networks have infiltrated local governments and law enforcement, making it nearly impossible for authorities to take effective action against them. What's emerged in Belgium is something that can only be described as a super cartel. This isn't just one organization, it's a coalition of the most powerful criminal groups in Europe, working together to control the narcotics trade. The super cartel operates like a multinational corporation, with each group bringing its own expertise to the table. The South American cartels provide the product, the European mafias handle distribution, and the local gangs enforce their will on the streets. It's a system that's as efficient as it is deadly. When you hear the phrase war on narcotics, it conjures up images of determined law enforcement officers, massive narcotic busts, and a relentless pursuit of justice. But if you dig a little deeper, especially in Europe, it becomes clear that this so-called war is more of a losing battle. Despite decades of effort, billions of euros spent, and countless loss, the narcotics trade is not only alive and well, it's thriving. And Belgium stands as a stark example of the futility of these efforts. Let's face it, the global war on narcotics has been a colossal failure, and nowhere is this more evident than in Europe. The continent's struggle to stem the tide of crack flooding its borders has been nothing short of disastrous. Despite sophisticated technology, international cooperation, and countless crackdowns, crack keeps pouring in, year after year, as if the efforts to stop it are barely making a dent. And that's because in many ways, they aren't. The core of the problem lies in the economics of the trade. It's a multi-billion euro industry driven by insatiable demand and fueled by the enormous profits that come with supplying that demand. Law enforcement can seize tons of crack in a single bust, and it might make headlines for a day or two, but it hardly puts a dent in the overall supply. Why? Because for every shipment that's intercepted, 10 more are slipping through undetected. The traffickers expect losses. They build them into their business model, and even with those losses, the money to be made is staggering. The profit margins are astronomical, and that's what keeps the trade going, despite the risks. As long as there's money to be made, there will be people willing to take those risks, and no amount of law enforcement is going to change that fundamental fact. This economic reality is the driving force behind the trade, and it's why traditional law enforcement strategies have failed so spectacularly. The more the authorities crack down, the more the traffickers adapt. They get smarter, more sophisticated, and more violent. The war on narcotics is like a game of whack-a-mole. Every time they knock one down, another one pops up, and often with a vengeance. One of the most glaring examples of this is the increase in chaos that often follows major narcotics busts. You might think that taking down a major player or intercepting a huge shipment would weaken the trade, but in reality, it often has the opposite effect. When a gang leader is arrested or a shipment is seized, the remaining criminals don't retreat, they escalate. They become more brutal, more desperate, and more willing to resort to extreme measures to protect their turfs and their profits. Take Belgium, for instance. The country has seen its fair share of high-profile narcotic busts, with authorities seizing tons of crack in recent years. But these victories are often short-lived. The void left by an arrested kingpin is quickly filled by another, often even more ruthless figure. The violence spikes as rival gangs vie for control, and the streets become even more dangerous. It's a vicious cycle that law enforcement seems powerless to break. After the 2020 Belgian drug bust, the media hailed it as a major victory in the war on narcotics, but the celebration was short-lived. Despite the massive seizure, coke continued to flow into Europe at an alarming rate. Within weeks, it was as if the bust had never happened. The streets were still flooded with narcotics, the violence persisted, and the traffickers carried on with their business as usual. The problem isn't just that the narcotics keep coming, it's that the strategies being used to stop them are fundamentally flawed. Law enforcement is playing a losing game, trying to outsmart criminals who have the resources, the technology, and the connections to stay one step ahead. And as long as the economic incentives remain, the trade will continue to thrive, no matter how many busts or arrests are made. But it's not just the violence and the economic incentives that make the war on narcotics a losing battle. It's the deep-seated corruption that undermines every effort to fight it. In Belgium, as in many other countries, corruption is rampant, from the ports where the narcotics arrive to the highest levels of government. This corruption doesn't just grease the wheels of the narcotics trade, it actively fuels it, creating an environment where criminals can operate with impunity. This corruption creates a revolving door of crime, where arrests and crackdowns do little more than temporarily disrupt operations. The criminals know that as long as they have the money, they can buy their way out of trouble. And for every official that's arrested or exposed, there are always others waiting in the wings, ready to take their place. It's a system that perpetuates itself, making it nearly impossible for law enforcement to gain any real traction in the fight against the narcotics trade. The result is a situation where the war on narcotics feels more like a war of attrition, with no end in sight. The authorities may score occasional victories, but these are fleeting at best, and the long-term trend is one of increasing violence, more sophisticated criminal operations, and a narcotic trade that continues to thrive despite every effort to stop it. As we look ahead to the future of Belgium's narcotic empire, it's hard not to feel a sense of unease. The country has already descended into a chaotic landscape where corruption and fear are part of everyday life. The question now is, where does Belgium go from here? Will it continue its slide into deeper chaos, or is there a chance for meaningful reform that could turn the tide against the cartels that have taken root so deeply within its borders? The ongoing battle between law enforcement and the narcotics trade in Belgium is a complex and evolving struggle. On one hand, the authorities are under massive pressure to clamp down on the rampant trafficking that has turned Belgium into Europe's crack capital. On the other hand, the criminals they're up against are more sophisticated, more organised, and more ruthless than ever. Looking forward, it's not hard to imagine a scenario where the chaos continues to escalate. The narcotics trade has already transformed parts of Belgium into virtual war zones, and as long as the demand for crack remains high across Europe, the traffickers will have every incentive to keep fighting for their piece of the pie. This could mean even more grenade attacks, more kidnappings, and more bodies turning up in the streets as rival gangs vie for dominance. In this scenario, Belgium could see a further breakdown in law and order, with entire neighbourhoods falling under the control of criminal organisations, making it increasingly difficult for the government to assert any real authority. But there's another possibility, one where Belgium doesn't descend into further chaos, but instead begins to claw its way back from the brink. This would require a radical shift in strategy, moving away from the traditional law enforcement approach that has clearly failed to curb the narcotics trade. One potential avenue for reform could be taking a page out of Portugal's playbook. Let's go back a bit. In 2001, Portugal made the bold decision to decriminalise all narcotics, shifting its focus from criminal punishment to health-based intervention. Instead of arresting and prosecuting narcotic users, the country now offers treatment and rehabilitation services, aiming to reduce harm and reintegrate individuals into society. The results have been promising. Narcotic-related deaths have plummeted, HIV infection rates have dropped, and overall narcotics use has stabilised. Could this model work in Belgium? It's a tough question. On one hand, decriminalisation could reduce the burden on Belgium's criminal justice system, freeing up resources to focus on the traffickers and kingpins rather than the users. It might also reduce some of the violence, as users would no longer need to engage with the criminal underworld to obtain their narcotics. Moreover, by treating addiction as a health issue rather than a criminal one, Belgium could begin to address the root causes of narcotics abuse, offering people a way out of the cycle of addiction and crime. However, there are also significant challenges and potential drawbacks to this approach. Belgium's problem is not just about consumption, it's about the massive international trafficking networks that use the country as a gateway to Europe. Decriminalisation might help reduce domestic narcotic-related crime, but it's unlikely to make a significant dent in the large-scale operations run by organised crime syndicates. Furthermore, decriminalisation could be seen as a softening of the government's stance on cartels, which might embolden traffickers and lead to an increase in narcotic-related activity. There's also the risk that decriminalisation could attract more users to Belgium, drawn by the prospect of less punitive laws. This could exacerbate the problem, leading to higher levels of consumption and potentially even more trafficking to meet the increased demand. In a country already struggling with the sheer scale of the trade, this is a risk that would need to be carefully managed. Let's take a step back and consider the bigger picture. Belgium's crisis is not just a national issue, it's part of a larger global problem that stretches across continents and involves countless actors, from the coca farmers in South America to the street dealers in Europe. The war on narcotics has been waged for decades, and yet the global trade is more robust than ever. Belgium's role in this crisis highlights the limitations of the current approach and raises important questions about the future of narcotic policy, not just in Belgium, but across the world. As we look at Belgium's situation within this global context, it becomes clear that no single country can solve the problem on its own. The cartels that operate in Belgium are part of a vast network that spans the globe, and their operations are driven by the relentless demand for narcotics in wealthy nations. As long as there is demand, there will be supply. And as long as there is supply, there will be violence and corruption. This brings us to some of the most pressing moral and ethical questions surrounding the war on narcotics. Is it right to continue down the path of prohibition, knowing that it leads to such devastating consequences? Or should we be exploring alternative approaches, even if they come with their own set of risks? The current model of criminalisation has clearly failed to achieve its goals, but the alternatives are fraught with uncertainty. If Belgium were to lead the way in rethinking narcotic policy, it could set a powerful example for the rest of Europe and the world. But this would require bold leadership, a willingness to take risks, and a commitment to addressing the root causes of the narcotic crisis, rather than just its symptoms. It would also require a recognition that the trade is not just a criminal issue, but a social, economic, and public health issue that needs to be tackled from multiple angles. This raises some profound questions about the future, not just for Belgium, but for the entire international community. How did we get here? And what can be done to stop this downward spiral? As we contemplate the future, it's impossible to ignore the need for a new approach. Albert Einstein once said, "The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results." This quote rings particularly true when it comes to the ongoing fight against narcotics trafficking. We've been using the same strategies for decades, yet the result remains the same. More narcotics, more chaos, and more lives destroyed. It's time to acknowledge that the current approach isn't working, and to consider alternative solutions that address the root causes of the narcotics crisis rather than just the symptoms. As Belgium faces its uncertain future, the choices it makes will have far-reaching consequences. The country is at a crossroads, and the decision it makes in the coming years will determine whether it continues its descent into chaos or begins to reclaim its status as a peaceful, prosperous nation. The global community too must take note of Belgium's experience and consider how it can be used to inform a broader rethinking of narcotics policy. What are your thoughts on Belgium's story? Let us know in the comments below. And if you like our content, don't forget to check out the channel. We've got many more stories from the underworld to share with you. We'll see you in the next one.